Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of Boston University School of Theology, the Office of Development and Alumni Relations, we are delighted that you are here this evening. We have a series of special events that are all combined in this event, and we've decided to move it into this room so that we can record it and have it for posterity. For those of you who've been visiting the school, you know that we've had an exhibit that opened a couple weeks ago and has now been expanded, particularly over this weekend, and will be on display over the next 6 months at the School of Theology, a series of icons depicting civil rights leaders. Tonight we have a special presentation, and I'd like to introduce you to our Dean, Dr. Mary Elizabeth Moore.
Thank you very much. I have 4 introductions to make. First is an introduction and welcome to Boston University. If you've read the most recent Bostonia, you know that Boston University is the home of a school of engineering that prepares engineers to contribute to the quality of life for individuals and society. You know that BU has a School of Law that has been named for the 2nd year as the best law faculty in the country by the Princeton Review. And you know that the BU School of Theology has been known as the School of the Prophets since the 1890s, when the faculty and students of this school hit the streets of Boston because they were worried about the immigrant people who were not receiving adequate services, opportunities for jobs. And ever since, we've been trying hard to live up to that reputation. As a way of welcoming you, I want to invite particularly our African American graduates of Boston University to stand and let us give honor to you tonight. This is the first event, this and the afternoon event are the first events of the Boston University Alumni Weekend. This particular event is sponsored by the Lowell Institute, and so that's my second introduction. The Lowell Institute was founded in 1836. It was founded the year that John Lowell died, and ever since they have been supporting cultural, intellectual, and socially significant events in the Boston region. Every year, they give us a major donation in order for us to sponsor the Lowell Lecture. And our Lowell lecturer tonight is of world renown and of deep human and religious social passion. We are so lucky, and I'm not going to say any more because someone else will introduce him. My third introduction is of our artist, Pamela Purdy. Pamela Purdy did her MFA degree at the University of Massachusetts, and she has taught art for 30 years. She's taught in high schools. She has taught in various colleges and universities, including the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. She has, in recent years, created the Civil Rights Icon exhibit, which has now been shown in more than 20 places, including showing during the inauguration of Barack Obama in Washington, D.C. This year, we are privileged to have the Civil Rights Icon exhibit in Boston University School of Theology through the middle of March, and Pamela Purdy has a special presentation to make.
Thank you, Dean Moore. Reverend Lawson, you have no idea how thrilling it is for me to meet you, a living icon of the civil rights movement. I have recreated an icon in your honor, and I hope you like it.
Thank you, Pamela. And this will now be part of this traveling exhibition, and we are grateful. My last introduction is of Calvin Morris, a 3-time degree winner from Boston University. He matriculated in Boston University in 1963, and he was graduated with his 3rd degree in 1982. In between, at the age of 25, he was serving a major post in the SCLC. Following that, he became executive director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Social Change in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was also serving as associate pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church with Daddy King. During the time he served in that role, he came to Boston University to preach the sermon when the King Memorial was dedicated on Marsh Plaza. Since that time, he moved to Howard University, and at Howard, he served for 16 years as Director of Ministries to Culture at Church and Culture, and as a member of the faculty in Practical and Pastoral Theology. And he has done many other things in his lifetime. He moved from Howard to the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, where he served for some years as Executive Vice President for Academic Services and Academic Dean. And he is presently the Executive Director of the Community Renewal Society in Chicago, Illinois, where he will retire at the end of this year. And we just can't wait to find out what he's going to do next. He will introduce our speaker for the evening. Thank you, Calvin Morris.
Thank you, Dean Moore. One of the things that I find that will get under my skin is when you go to a place where a renowned person is to speak, and you have before you the resume. Now, you don't have all of that for our speaker, Reverend Lawson. But if you did have it, you would be able to read what I, as a person introducing him, you'd be able to read it for yourselves. Well, I'm not going to do that, a long thing, because it would go on forever and ever and ever. I would say to you, though, that when I think of Reverend James Lawson, 2 songs come to mind. One, we sang often during the Civil Rights Movement. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. I changed those words a little bit in relationship to James Lawson, and I would say I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on justice. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on justice. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on justice. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. There's another song that reminds me of James Lawson. Now, it is not a song that we necessarily sang during the Civil Rights Movement, but within the Black Christian tradition, it was often sung. I'm on the battlefield for my Lord. Yes, I'm on the battlefield for my Lord. And I promised to him that I would serve him till I die. I'm on the battlefield for my Lord. Well, James Lawson, in his entire career, in his life, has exemplified one who always wakes up with his mind on freedom and justice, his mind on equity, his mind on peace, his mind on all of those things which give value to the human spirit and human soul. He has given his life. It is a part of who he is, his DNA, to be involved in social movements. And so he's been a mentor and a teacher and a counselor and a guide and a strategic thinker around issues that have made the 20th century and the second half of the 20th century a pivotal reality in the life not only of the United States, but also of the world. Tudor sat at the feet of the Gandhians in India, became a tutor and teacher to Martin Luther King Jr., became an advisor and a teacher and a tutor to James Bevel and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette and John Lewis, et cetera, and so forth. Knew A.J. Mussey, the founder of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Knew James Farmer was a part of CORE. You go on and on and on. And practically everyone in this civil rights grouping are people that James Lawson knew, people with whom he worked, people with whom he struggled. And so we have with us a man of this kind of breadth and depth, but a man who is really one of the most humble people I think I've ever met. And you would think that with all that he has done, all the people he has known, all the events that he has been a part of, that there would be a little big head about him, but it's not. There's not. Because I think he has grasped the fact that we are all made of one blood to dwell on the face of the earth. And there are things in the world, in the society, that separate us and delineate us as some people who have, some who don't have, some who are black, some who are white, some who are gay, some who are straight, and we have our gradations. And for James Lawson, they mean nothing, because he recognizes that the God who created us with power and created us with purpose, and we can use that to glorify God. Because in the glorification of God, in the face of Jesus Christ, we honor the Lord, and we honor all of creation. James Lawson, you woke up this morning and every morning with your mind stayed on freedom and justice. And you decided to stay on the battlefield for the Lord. And you promised him that you would serve him till you die. And it is an honor to present you to this group tonight, Reverend James Lawson.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Kelvin Morris, for that astonishing invitation. I'll try not to digest it. And thanks a lot to artist Pamela Purdy for this icon and for her thoughtfulness in doing it and presenting it this evening. That's a picture of me in the Jackson, Mississippi City Jail. And 1961, the 50th, this is the 50th anniversary, isn't it? Yeah, and then that's a side view of it. One of the experiences that I continue to relate to. I want to express my appreciation for being here. So I want to give a word of thanks to Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore, who has been my colleague, one of our colleagues out in CalPAC conference. She was there struggling when I got there in 1974, when I was appointed to Holman Church in 1974. And she continued to work to be, she was already a scholar, a budgeting scholar, but she was then ordained also in our conference, which in some annual conferences, for a woman to be ordained was a long struggle in the 70s and 80s. And I appreciate deeply the fact that she's here at Boston and as the dean, and appreciate very much being her companion in the way along these last 30 or 40 years. I want to say a word of appreciation for Boston and Boston University, and I've heard some very wonderful, exciting things yesterday and today, and the knowledge of the #1 law school in the university is wonderful. We have a lawyer's son in LA, and so that's always been also very, very dear to our hearts. But it is good to be here again. I, in some ways, count myself extremely fortunate, because in college, preparing for the ministry and preparing for ordination and all, I excluded the School of Theology at BU from my list of possible schools. And that was not because I did not know it was a school of prophets. Walter Mueller was the dean. Harold DeWolf was a speaker in the chapel in my undergraduate school, and I came to know him. In my sophomore year in college, I was assigned a book by Charles Brightman, Moral Authority, that we were supposed to read that week, and I sat up all night that night and read it from cover to cover. So I was always excited by BU and by the School of Theology and its faculty. I knew a number of people there, so I decided I'd better go someplace where I was not as well acquainted with the work over the decades, and where indeed I might have something to quarrel about, to fuss about. So I did go to other schools. But in 1960, early March, when I was expelled from Vanderbilt, not by the School of Divinity School at Vanderbilt, but by from the angling of two of the trustees on the executive board of the trustees, who were thoroughly entangled in the struggle in Nashville to desegregate the city, and who decided that I was if they were able to get rid of me out of Vanderbilt, then the movement would fade away. How foolish. So 2 months before I was to finish the master's degree, they expelled me. But then the net result was that theological schools, especially our United Methodist theological schools from around the country, invited me to come. And the BU faculty agreed to take all my credits, not to require a year residency. It was the best offer, easily. So in June of 1960, Dorothy and I came here. We had just a splendid 10 weeks in Boston and at the School of Theology, just a splendid. We often point back to it and think about it. It was, of course, a rest from the hectic travel that I did in the struggle and all, but at the same time, the School of Theology offered me so much provocation and stimulation that we can never forget that 10 weeks. And I was able to march on August the 14th, 1960, with that master's degree. I consider myself someone especially privileged. On the one side, I am a graduate of BU, with only a 10 weeks duration residency. On the other side, I also went to Oberlin Graduate School of Theology, and then in September of 1958, transferred my work into Vanderbilt. And I appreciate the fact very much that I had the special privilege of being acquainted with and working with just wonderful scholars of scriptures and ethics and theology, so that it met in so many different ways my ambitions for the theological education. I did drop out of graduate school. I did not go on towards a PhD, which I hadn't planned to do. But that's because that's another story. I dropped out in order to move south and to join the emerging struggle. And I've never regretted dropping out for that purpose. And I've been exhilarated over the years by the theological schools that helped to undergird my life and help me continue to move in the directions that I felt I needed to move. I can't quite see up here with the light in my eyes, but I think it's about 7:45, and I'm going to try to speak no more than 45 minutes. And then is an opportunity for comments and questions or not? So that will leave us about a few minutes for comments and the rest. Now, you have to understand that when I don't bring notes into the lectern, I may never stop talking. And unlike a soldier, I won't, in retiring, simply fade away. But I want to try to do this as succinctly as I can. I wish I could see more of your faces, because I know there are friends out here that I have already greeted, and I would love to be able to talk and look into your faces as well. I've decided to use the theme, where do you go from here, chaos or community? And I've deliberately chosen that to help me keep in my heart and head Martin Luther King Jr. the struggle and the movement, the campaigns and the movement of the 50s and 60s, I try to insist that there's an intensified number of years that must be observed, 1953 to 1973. A 20-year period. It needed to go on for another 20 years, minimally. It did not. And to remember also in this lecture this evening, the millions of people of this country whose names are not in any of the books. A few people who were assassinated are in the books. But there were over 110 martyrs of the struggle in the years 53 to 73. And that group includes only the people who, in the midst of campaigns in different parts of the South, were killed primarily because of their participation in some fashion. What is not in the books are the black folk who were not engaged in the struggle, but whose bodies were found in rivers in Alabama and Mississippi and elsewhere. Cold cases in many instances, murders that have never been solved, but that represented the terror, the violence, the underbelly of American society that we continue to want to ignore. So where do we go from here? Chaos or community? That, of course, some of you will know is the final, not the final, but the next to last book published by King. And it was not just the title of a book. It represented conversations and engagement in the struggle in the South. It represented the considered opinion and judgment of a fair variety of people who were intellectually involved as well as spiritually, morally, and physically engaged. And I contend that it is probably the singularly most significant question that comes out of that which is called the civil rights movement. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And you can already frame your own responses to that question. The movement was about far more than civil rights. And those of us who were pastors doing much of the struggle saw our work not as civil rights work, but as the absolutely demanded work of the gospel of Jesus. You need to understand that because that's a message that Christianity in the United States has largely neglected and ignored. That movement in the stretches of period, in the stretches of time that I've delineated, represents one of the most extraordinary adventures of a people in the history of the earth. Not just to insist that it was indeed more than a second American Revolution. It was indeed more than the issues that we sought to address, and more than even the direct action that we used. It was a movement that can be said to be an offer, an invitation of redemption to our society, to our country, and a prophetic word to Western civilization. And I saw Martin King, as the Moses that the United States needed, or even as a Jesus figure, perhaps the second coming of Jesus, or the third coming, or the 100th coming that was a sign that the nation dared in its foolishness to ignore. A liberating moment for our history. A prophet raised by God, but more, I think, significant than that, a prophet chosen by a movement, by a people. To think of the years that I'm describing, one must think of the fact that with a bus boycott on December the 5th, 1955, a gathering in the afternoon to celebrate the effectiveness of that first day, 100 or more civic, religious, business, sorority, fraternal, university people gathered at the Holt Street Baptist Church. All of them sensing that they did it one day, they had to do it the second day, and so forth and so on. So organized a structure to direct the boycott, intuitively understanding that none of the structures they had in the community were adequate for the moment, for the time. And a half dozen people had talked and thought about it. And Martin King, representing that group of civic folk, was nominated to be president. The people, a movement. Black folks stayed off the buses in the numbers of 40 to 50,000 people. Young people walked that day rather than to ride the bus. The young, the elderly, the religious, the non-religious were so unified by the preparations done by people like Mary Jo Robinson and Rosa Parks and Vera Carr and a host of others, that they not only did it, but they said we have to do it again and again and again, and they did it for 381 days. Now, I'm laying that before you because I want you to see this movement as larger than what I or anyone else has been able to fully comprehend and describe. I'm working on an outline to assist in the understanding of the struggle, because it's unknown, it's not there. And so many people, even the academics, and I've read many of the books and I continue to read them, miss the essential character of that struggle. So where do we go from here, chaos or community? Let me quickly use one illustration of why this is a living legacy, why the past is infused in the very present moment in 2011. A few days ago, you will all remember that there were 2 obituaries announced in the same day in the newspaper. Fred Shuttlesworth and Steve Jobs. In the Los Angeles Times, the middle section of the paper, which is called the LA Extra, had a front page picture on that second section of Steve Jobs. In the middle had a picture also on the first page. Had a small bleep on this second section front page of a picture of Fred. On the inside of that paper, there were 4.5 full pages of photographs and narrative of Steve Jobs. There was a half page, 2 pages back, on Fred Shuttlesworth. course, Steve Jobs died leaving the Apple Corporation, other corporations, but also with an estate of $8 billion. He died as a kind of a wizard of technology. It's not yet certain whether that technology is blessing us or laying the framework for cursing us as a people. It obviously has been an extraordinary money-making device for all sorts of people. Fred Shuttlesworth, on the other side of the coin, was a Baptist preacher who was absolutely convicted by the notion that, as Howard Thurman said, the gospel of Jesus is a survival kit for the people whose backs are up against the wall. I remember Fred because I met him in '58. Every time there was a bombing of Fred's house, or that he was beaten up, or he was bombing of his church, I went into Birmingham to visit with him and to give him the support from the Racial Justice Department of the NCC and from FOR and from Martin King. So I went in every year, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63. I was an advanced staff person in Birmingham for the SCLC campaign of 1963. So I came to love Fred. His simplicity of spirit, complicated by a variety of kinds of the complications that can pursue any of us and all of us. Simple, but he was a man who, when the NAACP was outlawed in Alabama, started a local group for the state, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Never got very large, but he knew that it had to be a vehicle out of the spirit of history that would do the job that had to be done in Birmingham. Fred Shuttlesworth, 1963, was indeed the fifth campaign of direct action, nonviolent direct action in the movement. One of the things we have to recognize is that the movement had at least a dozen different dimensions, none of which have been thoroughly explored or researched or understood. It has the dimension of the spiritual awakening, the spiritual, moral, political, consciousness raising of millions of people who did not know what happened to them, but saw Birmingham, saw the sit-in campaign of '60, saw the Freedom Ride of '61. Each of these movements making an impact, but helping the direct action, nonviolent spirit to emerge and to impact the nation. Those dimensions are well ignored. They are ignored at the peril of our society. Let me just quickly name another dimension. The NAACP is almost the only organization in the 30s that developed a strategy to change our land. They developed a legal strategy. They decided, we're going to see to it that the Constitution of the United States is going to be challenged in such a fashion that it becomes inclusive of all Americans. By the time they had finished, 75 or 80, no, the legal issues were not finished. The Constitution was declared by a Supreme Court almost each time with 9 votes to 0 on behalf of black people, Hispanic people, and women. Even the criminal, the Supreme Court announced in 1972, must have certain God-given rights that the governments must observe and recognize. Astonishing. That should be a cause for celebration in the nation. It never has been. No wonder you can have a federalist society. No wonder you can have this almost senseless notion that we're going to do the original intent of the Constitution. Not knowing our history. And the fact that it's something of a miracle that we have a Bill of Rights and a Declaration of Independence and a preamble to the Constitution and a Constitution that fundamentally suggests that we human beings can govern ourselves. But there has to be structures and processes and orders by which that self-government takes place. But it was excluded of necessity, so many people. The Constitution still has major decisions that insist it is for all of us and not just for the rich or for a few of us. In any case, Fred Shuttlesworth was a part of the nonviolent direct action dimension of the movement that basically called the nation to repentance and helped the nation to become a people more aware of one another, and more aware not only from whence we have come, but how much further we have to go. Let me describe it in this way. Here we are sitting at Boston University. In 1960, Boston had signs in windows of restaurants and lunch counters that said, "No dirty Irish allowed in here. No WAP. No Jew." The country was inundated with such signs in almost every state. These signs were there by custom, because of spiritual toxics that people ingested. They were also there in some places by virtue of laws that were crude laws for people that said we're going to be democratic, we're going to have self-governance. But they were there. In California, no Jew sign. Outside of San Clemente, there were signs that said no Negro should allow the sun to set on them in San Clemente, California. There was a second sign in San Clemente that said no Jew should allow themselves the sun to set on them here. No Indians, no Chinks, no Japs, no Mexicans. In some places there were no Catholic signs. It was a spiritual poison across the United States, and the religious groups never challenged them anywhere. And the challenge began in Nashville, in fact, in the Nashville campaign that began the process of the signs coming down. 1964, the Civil Rights Bill that was passed made such signs unconstitutional. There may still be such a sign in some area, no Indian sign maybe in South Dakota or North Dakota, but basically such signs that I think, a shame upon the character of this people, America. Those signs generally came down. The point I would make about the movement is that this struggle helped to cause our nation to become a better nation in so many different ways. It helped all of us to adopt the sense of hospitality that is still largely present in the United States. And there are all sorts of problems with it. Joe Fagan, a sociologist from Texas A&M who has spent the last 10 or 15 years doing fundamental research on racism, has suggested that while a majority of white people have said that racism must go, that a sizable percentage of white people continue to use even the language of racism in their private places in their private parties. So it was a large piece of work yet to do. But fundamentally, the nation began to change. The change is not yet complete. We have done much, but it must be done over and over again. But the values of our land are values that stress wealth and power and male domination, that stress the successes of a Steve Jobs, but largely forgets that if our nation has a spiritual dimension of hospitality across the land, it is the Fred Shuttlesworth, the movement that we call the Civil Rights Movement, that began to make that happen. Where do we go from here, chaos or community? I've said earlier already that the movement was an invitation to the nation to do some repentance and healing. And that healing must go forward. A part of the characteristic of our land today is the characteristic of chaos. King asked the question, where do we go from here? Chaos or community. The movement asked the question, dramatized the question, saying to the United States, saying to all of us, we have a choice. If we continue in the pathway where the toxic poisons continue to lurk in the present from the past without the nation waking up and facing the realities of where those poisons come from and how those poisons must be forced to vanquished and to be cleansed out of the earth of American life and spirituality. That's still the task remaining, because religion in the United States has in large measure operated from a frame of other concerns. As I helped to work in the struggle and the movement, I had a recognition that the movement was at the heart, the finest example of Christian faith in the United States at that time. The core of what I thought to be that meaning was Jesus in Mark 12, 28 to 34. You know, I'm sure, that story very, very well. The friendly scribe, according to the Mark account, who saw Jesus in the court of the temple, again and again taking puzzling issues and difficult questions from his opponents. But this scribe did not apparently sense himself as an opponent. He sensed himself as a friend. He was from some distance, maybe, hearing the conversation and appreciating the way in which Jesus responded over and over again, and then comes forward to suggest to Jesus his question, an issue discussed radically in those days and in that century in Judaism. And he asked, what is the first commandment? What is the first? What is the most important commandment? Now, that discussion is not in the Christian churches, apparently, in the United States. A way in which our Christianity has operated persistently for the last 20 or 30 years of in a sense, the cosmetic conflicts in local communities where some group wants to put up the 10 Commandments. And then because there are other people who say, no, not in public places, not in public buildings, you know the story, you know the conflict, again and again. Jesus responds to this scribe. What is the first commandment? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Then Jesus quickly comments, there is no commandment more important, greater than these. In the repetition of that episode, in Matthew, Jesus is made to say, upon these commandments hang the entirety of the law and the prophets. The movement was about attention to the neighbor. We had courage enough and faith enough to move into the midst of the hostility of racism and Jim Crow law, custom, attitudes, thoughts, worship, prayers, and to say, look, this must be dismantled because it violates entirely the critical mandate that to love God, to love eternity, to love truth, to love beauty, is to put at the center of that beauty the neighbor. Not some neighbors, but the neighbor, period. And all the neighbors that are available. I would love to have somebody in one of these communities wanting to put up the 10 Commandments. I would saying this is so important for public life. No, sisters and brothers, it's not that Jesus is abrogating the 10 Commandments, but is insisting in the Scriptures we must make choices. And the critical choice in our human journey is the choice of whether or not to give up on ourselves and to give up on others. That public life and private life has no dimensions in comparison to making people first, the babies first, the children first, the young people first. That we adults of the churches somehow, in our pulpits, in our communities, before mayors and city councils, we must somehow help our nation gain the spiritual insight that all religion is not good religion, that all religion is not the same, that all religion is not equal, that much of the complication of human life is that it is complicated, but there is a simplicity of spirituality and direction and journeying that if we avoid it, we lose everything. The movement was about community, beginning with the neighbor. To the extent to which our nation has not heard that message, has not wondered why so many folk, Rosa Parks, Matthew McCullum, were people of the churches, people of faith and love. To that extent, the nation has lost, in some ways, the voice of eternity that it must come to hear if their nation is to recover its own finest moments of its own history. So the choice is ours. The movement sought to make that, sought to help us see that choice and that possibility. What I'm insisting is here that the movement was more than a civil rights movement. The movement of the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, the intensified 20 years, was indeed a voice of God calling the nation to make choices about where we go from here. Then the third thing I want to lift up about the struggle and the movement, especially this nonviolent direct action dimension, that it was a call. It was a call to say that the nation may be so wrapped up in its violence that it will not be able to extract itself in the short and the long run. King lifted up. He did not begin as a nonviolent practitioner, though I have no doubt that spiritually and biblically he was there with the massive call that shattered and transformed his calling and his life in 1955. He did not use in the early speeches in Birmingham, in Montgomery, the language of nonviolence. I did find one source here a few months ago where it seems, and I'm still trying to check it out, that he used the term nonviolence for the first time, and perhaps on January 30th, 1956, when his house was bombed. And in the yard, confronting a very unruly and angry crowd of people who were disciplined in their behavior and action, but surprised and dismayed that there would be a bombing in this preacher's home, their spokesperson's home. And King did go out and talk to them. And in the process there, I found this first place where he used the term nonviolence. In any case, no matter when that first happened, he urged the spirituality. December the 5th, 1955, he says at Holt Street Baptist Church in his remarks, "None of us are going to go downtown and burn a cross." Did not just call for love, but he said, we're not going to imitate the wrong, the indignity that we know that has been inflicted upon us. He had that fundamental spirituality. But no matter, where other bus boycotts in 53 had not really used the Gospels of Jesus as a underlying ideology and theology, within weeks of the struggle, I intend to pin it down one day, King was using the language nonviolence, the term nonviolence. Now, there's a great difficulty in the United States about that term, because we've had in the United States the Fellowship of Reconciliation, we've had in the United States the Quaker perspective, we've had in the United States the perspective of the Mennonite and the Brethren and a number of other units of the Christian churches that have called themselves pacifist. I don't know if you know the story of how Gandhi, wrestling in South Africa around 1906, rejected the notion of pacifism, rejected the notion of non-resistance, rejected the notion of passive resistance. All of those terms in the history of that side of Christianity, Gandhi rejected and coined for the first time the term nonviolence. And yes, he coined the term as a positive term, as a force more powerful, as a power that had the capacity to help the human race direct itself towards our best and noblest visions and intentions. You may or may not know that in the 40s and 50s, Niebuhr was at odds with A.J. Muste, who's been mentioned this evening, and with others in the pacifist movement. Niebuhr was insisting that pacifism doesn't recognize the use of power. As a freshman in college at Baldwin Wallace, as I met FOR members and said, I must be a pacifist, I began also to read Gandhi. I was told in some discussions on pacifism that love is not coercive. Love is more persuasive. It's not coercive. I didn't know what that meant because in many ways as I live and move and act, I know that the power of the love of God translated through my parents and my older sisters, 5 of them, who welcomed me into our home. The love of the people of the congregation of St. James AME Zion Church in Massillon was an undescribable experience that gave me a sense of being a human being, a child before God. It gave me a sense that in a hostile society caused me to reject the hostile society. Your definitions of me are all wrong, inhuman, torturous. I'm none of what you say I am. I am, rather, Jim Lawson, a son of God, a son of man, a son of life, the son of my parents, the son of the stream of the ancestors of slavery in the United States, in this American history. I often thank God that I was born black in America because I did not have the impact of having to wrestle with a cultural religion that allowed me to then discredit and abuse my fellow human being. And I could hear in my reading and studies of the scriptures in elementary school and high school, Jesus who offered life under the unconditional grace of God. The movement was a word to the United States, to Western civilization. For 600 years, our nation, not 600 years, but 600 years, the nations of the West have boasted of the superiority of white civilization. And today, a fierce effort is being made by the Chamber of Commerce, the Council on Foreign Affairs, the Pentagon, the CIA, covert government, and the Congress, and the presidents, to allow that 600 years where the wealth and mineral wealth and the technological wealth and the human wealth of the earth will be owned by the minority of the race in the Western world and in the United States. Globalization, which we Christians ought to not use, is but a way of talking about the colonial period of 600 years of conquest and religion and gold. Military purposes will be morphed internationally in a fashion that the people of Nigeria and especially the elite that colonialism has produced will never know that their wealth, their opportunity to develop themselves is draining away in the globalization process, another name for 600 years of conquest and gold out of the West. It is a word of nonviolence. Nonviolence is power. Nonviolence is the power of love, the power of truth, the power of beauty and wonder. It is the mystery of human life and the mystery of the universe. Sometimes I maintain that nonviolent power is simply the power that God has given us in the birth of a baby, the power of life, the power of evolving, the power of truth, the power of physical development. And I maintain that it is that power that is available to us whether we want to use it or not. King has, in many ways, is the symbol of that offering to Western world. He himself said that increasingly the choice is between co-annihilation or coexistence. He himself insisted that if the human race, and especially the United States, did not transform its values away from war to doing justice, away from divisiveness towards helping to create a unity of the human family, and especially of the American family, away from the use of our huge, massive resources for wealth gathering or for technological achievement, to the infinitely more patient and more necessary task of constructing and achieving genuine human community, the will of God on earth, the beloved community in place after place. If we cannot transfer our ambitions and our talent, a society consumed by fear, a fear that is there in large measure because it has rejected the notion that human community, that Boston community, can become a reality of the presence of God. The movement King is the symbol and sign of it. It is a word about how to manage struggle and conflict. It can be done in a fashion that undermines and sabotages the human spirit and the human community, or it can be done in such a fashion that, yes, even opponents do come around. They come around not because they're converted overnight. That's not the case of nonviolence. They come around because nonviolence charges them with a change of their behavior that's on behalf of all of the community. Nonviolence uses power, puts into the field a power that was not there. Just, we're talking a lot these days about Cairo and the Arab Spring. Well, remember that what happened in Cairo in February and April took a long time of coming. I happen to know that part of the training film that I like that shows a part of the work of my work in Nashville was used as training film in Egypt 8 years ago, translated into Arabic. I know, as an example, the comic book that I used in 1958 on campuses and around in my training work, the Montgomery Story, the story of Martin Luther King Jr., Nonviolence Movement by the Fellowship of Reconciliation, was copied and was found on internet, and the lady made thousands of copies of it and passed them out around the city. So we had influences there, but the Mubarak regime did not anticipate the power of people who withdrew their consent from his government, and then not only withdrew their consent, and that happened over a period of time, were willing then to gather in the Tahrir Square of Cairo, and not just there, but across Egypt, millions of people. That put into the politics of Egypt a different form of power, engineered and engendered by the people themselves. And that new power caused the Mubarak government to collapse and to resign. Nonviolence is not pacifism. Nonviolence is indeed the practice of putting in politics an energy that is committed to the well-being not just of some, but of all people. And so what I want to push this evening, two things finally, and that is one, the need for the university centers, especially the schools of theology, to raise the question as to whether or not, especially the direct action symbol and sign dimension of that's called the civil rights movement. The theology of nonviolence ought not to be a centerpiece for the training of clergy. How you handle conflict, how you work in the community creatively for the building of the community. One of the things I'm most proud of in my work, it's not a pride that is arrogant or a pride that is foolish, but one of the things that I have liked and I like about my past, that as I left the Fellowship of Reconciliation to return to the pulpit, and I had my first assignment of a pulpit in 1950, and took a church in Shelbyville, Tennessee, and then was appointed to a second church in Centenary in Memphis, Tennessee, and then consented to a third appointment in Los Angeles at Holman. I had no idea when I went to Shelbyville that I was going to be involved in helping them move on the necessity of a new building, a new worship place, a new area as a base for their work. I did not know that. I almost didn't take the task, almost declined going. Dorothy and I are delighted that we went because it was one of the most amazing experiences we've ever had. In 22 months, we were able to see the organization of that congregation that was badly demoralized in such a fashion that in 22 months, that was not my decision, the 22 months, it was the bishop's decision. In 22 months, we caused an ordinary people in a rural county seat, to begin to dream, and then to purchase land and to build a building from bottom to the top, and to reclaim their own power. It was done by the process of helping the congregation to accept the tasks that they had. In 3 different congregations, I was able to organize those congregations in such a fashion that building construction and raising budgets were done without a serious disorder or conflict in the process of making it happen. Fundamentally, trying to use the gospel of Jesus rather than a cultural understanding of how you build a building. This while engaged in other ministries, but the central task, it seems to me, of helping, and at Holman Church, it was 2,000 people when I began. And you know, a large congregation is a coalition of families, a coalition of congregations. You can organize a large congregation by a great variety of different ways. So everyone is not of common mind, but we tackled the necessity of finishing that campus. It was a several $million project, and off-street parking. And it was done with the folk making a hugely consensus decision so that there were no conflicts that interfered with the work going forward. I do this not to boast, but to simply say that somehow theological education must include how you manage struggle and conflict, and to examine the infinite possibilities of the growing field, academic and otherwise, growing evidence that there is available in the universe a moral imperative to violence and fear and insecurity that can help in the midst of our society a new emergence. The question is often asked of me in recent days that the occupying become a movement, and I cannot say because no one can predict that. But I want to say that if the occupying movement across the nation, campaign, I say across the nation, the preliminaries perhaps to a movement, to a campaign, it must develop a staunch vision of nonviolent discipline. It must develop a plan, a strategy for change that is both short-term and long-term, and must help a unity of the human spirit from all directions to emerge so that there's a readiness, a willingness to carry the burden of a plan and a discipline that can shake our country in fashions that will cause the past 100 years of nonviolent struggle to pale in comparison. But see Martin Luther King, see the movement as a prophet for nonviolence, for recovering of the deep meaning of love and the gospel of Jesus, and for the creating of power that did change the United States for a time. Not yet enough. The task ahead of us is far more complicated and far more arduous than the tasks behind us. I think we, the people, are in peril, such as we have never had before. For a nation to be wasting time about deficits and cutting Head Start and cutting this and cutting that, and ignoring 800 military installations in 130 countries that we pay for, opening up new military bases in Africa, a new Afra Command that's going to build a series of bases down the East Coast with its present commanding general, a black man stationed in Germany. New bases being built, new drives, in large measure by plantation capitalism, the big corporations that want to see to it that the funds of the earth and the talent of the earth flow towards Western civilization, whether we know what to do with it or not. We are in peril. The Tea Party people and the conservative movement is simply a morphing of the old racism and Jim Crow law, the old sexism, the old violence, the old hatred, with a nice term, conservative, which doesn't mean anything except that we're going to maintain violence, racism, sexism, economic injustice and inequity into the next 100 years, if at all possible. And they don't even know that that's what they represent. And the Republican Party, moving in that direction, has not the slightest inkling that they are sickling over their own humanity. They forget entirely, unconsciously and consciously, that they were birthed to be children of God, birthed to be alive, to be human, not to govern over indignities heaped upon other people. If I could hear the nonviolent movement for just 1 second suggestion, I'd say to us in the theological schools, we ought to teach an ethic for the nation that says that our budgets ought to be aimed at the babies and the children and the young people as the number one priority. And let the rest of the aspects of life fall into place. First things first. I say to you simply, we need such a movement in the 21st century. That's what I'm teaching and preaching and using every ounce of energy I have to suggest it. We need in the 21st century movements beyond our imagination. And as the Boston University in the past has helped to stimulate some of the thinking, so maybe the School of Theology today can find ways by which they can frame the training of preachers, pastors, prophets, who see the interconnectedness of pastoring a congregation, who recognize that when they pray when they walk into a sick room, into an ER room, into a crisis of a family, that's one of the highest forms of prayer. Not what they say, but by their presence. That in the same sense that when they walk in the streets with a group of poor people seeking to help them gain the power to lift and change their own status, that is a form of preaching the gospel that perhaps cannot be matched. That when indeed they stand in their pulpit amidst their own people, using not the creeds, not the ideologies, but the gospel of Jesus, they stand in that splendid stream of life that in the civil rights movement, I think, reflected as perhaps at no other time in the history of our country. And I commend you to choosing, as I know that most of us have, community over chaos, hope over despair, and conversion and sanctification over despair. Thank you. Thank you. Do we have time for a couple of comments? Okay.
15 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right.
We have time for, we have about 15 minutes for some, for comments and questions. And because we're taping, we would appreciate it if you would please raise your hand if you have one, and Jacqueline Jones will bring you the microphone so you can speak your question into the microphone, and Jim will hear it and respond.
Thank you so much for such a great lecture tonight. I'm interested in your thoughts about your perspective of the civil rights movement over and against the movement for civil rights for lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual persons in America, and the lack of articulation of the needs for civil rights for this community from the African American community, particularly the African American church, with its very often being the homophobic rhetoric that's uttered from the black pulpits across our nation.
Well, I've pastored two large congregations in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, where we had openly gay lesbian people, and we had openly gay couples in Memphis, there was no such thing as their saying, "I'm out of the closet," and I never heard them suggest that, but they were openly gay in their way in which they lived and walked, and this was very well known in the congregation. And if there were, as I'm sure there might have been, people who had various objections, they did not express those objections to those people, and they did not share those objections and criticism to other people in the congregation. And that may be a peculiar thing of the largely black congregation. I do not believe myself that this approach or homophobic attitudes towards GLBT people is endemic to the black church. It is primarily orchestrated by the Jim Dobsons, the late James, I've forgotten the name, Pat Robinsons, by the late Gerald Farwell, the late James Kennedy. It's a sense that's being pushed around by a huge talk radio show and television shows that preach it. And they have discovered it for a very simple reason. This kind of language was used against black people and some of those same people that I've named in the 50s and 60s, where they declared that the Bible requires racial segregation and Jim Crow law. And they used bad language and awful language about us, black folk. The movement across the 60s forced them to shut up. And it was about that time, at the end of the 60s, then that Pat Robinson and the 700 Club discovered the sinfulness of GLBT people and used the same kind of culture, what Peter Gomes calls culturism, to read into the Bible their particular fears and dreams. But worst of all, to read into the Bible their need to have a scapegoat in order to preach the gospel of Jesus, because they haven't discovered the healing, redeeming core of the gospel of Jesus or of the Christ. So they have to have this other perspective and all. It should be said at the same time that the unconditional grace of God, James Baldwin speaks of love as living in grace. And it is the possibility and the necessity for every human being. There is no doubt that we in the struggle of the 50s, 60s did not get as far as we wanted to get at demanding human rights, civil rights for all people. So I see the GLBT group as one of the groups that has to yet achieve the levels that they want for equality. The difficulty with that is not their struggle, but the difficulty with that is that that's one of the most powerful set of foundations in the United States, and very often they are managed by men, gay men, who still have their racism and elitism in their hearts. And so and I've worked with gay groups, on some of these issues, they are still perpetrating the male domination management control society, the repressive system of maybe the last 5,000 years. They have not yet joined seriously the human rights movement that must go towards nonviolence, must go to be inclusive of all humankind, and must break down the inequities that are available even in some of their activity. In Los Angeles, when Proposition 8 was on the board, any number of black gay men who are activists tried to get some of those foundations and the GLBT groups to pay attention to what kind of strategy would help them to galvanize and collect the support of the African American churches by and large in Los Angeles. And they were so racist that they could not accept that advice and counsel from activist people, including myself, including a number of other clergy. And so they did not do and were not supportive of the kind of effort that we knew would help save the day from the black community. So the so-called evangelicals are hammering away at the Hispanic community, the black community, to get those communities to adopt their ideological religion. And this is a place where we do need far more theological education, biblical education for all kinds of pastors across our country, of all kinds of complexions. So I do not subscribe to the notion that the congregation rejects civil rights and human rights issues. It's the way that they are approached, and it's the way in which they teach. There's a historic sense in the church. At St. James AME Zion Church in Massillon, Ohio, there was a hospitality, a genuine joy in one another in spite of issues and in spite of sins. That was wonderful to behold. And I mean, the congregations I've pastored have been congregations that wanted to stress graciousness and hospitality for everyone. The same was true in the Holman Church. But the issue is people are being denied. And an injustice anywhere, as King said, is a threat to justice everywhere. Moments of hatred and hostility for any people. And I don't want to minimize this issue because the Pat Robinsons, the Donald Wildmans, family focus, they've made this issue a central issue, and they are discussing it instead of the neighbor and what they need to be examining. Something else slipped my mind that I wanted to raise. Thank you. On this issue. There is no room in the Bible. No, that's not the way to say it. If you want to see the Bible in supernatural terms as calling for the end of history and the end of the earth and the rapture and all that stuff, which of course is not in the Bible, you can easily do it. And too many Christians in the United States are doing that. But if you're trying to pay attention to Jesus as the Word of God, not the written script, if you're paying attention to how God has across the centuries, millenniums, spoken to people in terms of their lives, in terms of history, then there is no room in the Bible for the rejection or the demonization of any other human being. And it does not matter who they are. One of the most important things that I have gained from the Bible is that it does ask us to make choices as to whether or not we land on the side of ideology and idolatry, or whether or not we land or see the necessity of following Jesus as a singular revelation of God's gracious care and purpose. And you have to make that choice. You can make a choice in the Bible for a war god, a tribal god, a money god. All sorts of gods are there. All sorts of spirits are there. So you can make choices for that. And somehow we have to encourage our people to listen to and hear the main choice, that the Word of God made flesh, full of grace and truth, is also available as a choice to make. And that choice does not give us any leeway for the hostility towards any human being or any group of human beings. That choice does not give us the right to make such choices we're making. But that's the bane of the church in these days. We love fighting over GLBT business, while we are able to therefore not get any conviction or compassion for the homeless and the hungry, and for people who are bitterly hurting. I've discovered across the years that in some of these very churches that are preaching this stuff, they have people who are hurting, and their own pastors do not have enough of Christ for them to pastor that hurt that often is over the sexual issue, over gay, lesbian, so forth, but also over a great number of other forms of pain. I've learned across the years that pastors in many congregations, rabbis in many congregations, are not aware of the fact that they have people in their pews who are wrestling with the issue of whether or not they're going to have bread next week or a shelter over their heads next week. I think that's an atrocious thing. The School of Theology needs to try to help the folk who come through here to have the lenses of eternity so that they can see and feel and hear and observe and are ready to take action, willing to get out there and do something about it. That's one of the things I know about the movement in the 60s. I didn't know what I was doing. I have to admit, I had never tried to plan a massive campaign like this in nonviolence. That's why I'm thankful for Gandhi, because he showed us the way very clearly, a methodology. But most of us did not know what we were doing. It was all brand new. But we had a sense that there's something wrong that needs to be corrected, and we had a passion that we were being called to get out there and try, failure or not. And that spirit, I think, is something the church needs today.
Our time is up, but I want to say thank you, Jim, for who you are, for what you've said, and for the challenges you've left with us that will not go away. Thank you very much.